start out with talking about the 70s movement and how the 70s kind of back to the land movement was very driven. Instead of homesteading being the counterculture of the 70s, counterculture caused people to look for homesteading as a solution to their problems. So if you think about the 1970s, and I really wish I printed out a graph for my dad. He said he couldn't get a hold of one. It was the stock market's history from 1902 to 2018, and it shows the Great Depression and the Great Recession and everything in between. If I had it here, I'd hold it up to the camera for you guys. But if you look at the 1970s, and from the late 60s into the early 80s, it's pretty much flat. It's up and down and up and down and up and down, but it's a flat line. It was a sideways skid. They called it stagflation. So there wasn't a lot of hope in the economy in the 1970s. We were coming out of the Vietnam War. We had the whole blowback from that. We had the whole, the baby boomers becoming young adults and being completely disillusioned with what was sold to them, watching their friends go away and come back not whole or not come back at all or come back in a body bag. And then there wasn't a lot of hope in the economy. And, there was the time when you had 100 people applying for one job and people started to look around for something else. And it had kind of this hippie ethos in it. And so people turned to back to the land thinking in a large way because it was a solution to a problem rather than because it was what they wanted, if that makes sense. That's my view of it. And it's why I think that as the economy rebounded in the 80s under the Reagan Revolution, and we went into this decade of complete opulence that the 80s was and carried through a lot into the 90s, a lot of the people that had taken a stab at that just said, hey, it's easier to get one of these decent jobs now than it is try to make a living on the land, because people were taking the approach in the 70s of not, I want a homestead in the city or in the suburbs or in this little place out of town, and it's a thing that I add on to my life. It was, I'm going to run away. And I think that's why it really wasn't very sustainable. And I'm not talking ecologically sustainable. I mean, able to keep going, right? That just as a movement, it wasn't very sustainable. And then we had, prior to that, the 1930s. And the 1930s had a pretty big movement of putting in the gardens and everything. And this was driven, of course, by the Great Depression. As the F-35 strafed me again, hopefully that doesn't come in too loud on the microphone. That's a loud one, though. But the 30s were a bit different. Most people that lived anywhere they could have a garden had a garden before the Depression hit. A lot of people think that during prior to the Depression, the roaring 20s, everybody was living high on the hog. There were plenty of poor people living off of their homesteads at the time before the crash. My grandfather said that the way they found out the Depression started is somebody told them, and the way they found out it was over is somebody told them, or they would have never noticed any difference. They did notice the whole war in between that he was drafted into, but yeah. That was where they lived in central Pennsylvania in the coal region. There wasn't really a whole lot of difference. Nobody was buying a bunch of stock anyway. But the people that were on the periphery, the people that were living with the job that was paying good money and they were investing and they were starting to build wealth, it got wiped out. They had to restart with whatever they had, and jobs were hard to come by. Really hard to come by. That's why we had things like, the Civilian Conservation Corps and stuff like that, where people left their families almost sort of like joining the military just for a job that didn't pay that much, but at least they had a job. And so it was kind of a natural fit. We hadn't walked away from it yet. Now, as I said yesterday, this idea that everybody in the 1930s knew how to feed themselves, and that's why they got through the Depression, is kind of out of touch with reality. There's been city folk and country folk, just to be blunt, for about as long as there's been cities. And there was a lot of urbanization. There's a lot of people that had left the farms. Farms had already started to get bigger. They weren't as big as they became in the 70s, but it wasn't just that everybody knew what to do. It's just there were a lot more people that did. So the movement that we saw then was less a movement and more just a natural response. I'll make the garden bigger, not I'll put a garden in. And of course, that eventually led to the victory gardens of World War II, which I think are well overplayed in the United States. I think it's a nostalgic thing to look back at. People certainly did it. But the real victory gardens that were needed were mostly in England, the United Kingdom, because England was really pinched off in their ability to procure supplies. So we kind of came through that. Then everybody came home. Right, all the GIs came home, the ones that were still with us, and we got busy with building the interstate highway system. We had this little problem in the middle called the Korean War. We'll just forget about that because that's what we did. And things kind of boomed until the 70s, which is where we started out at. And that's the two big movements in the last 100 years other than where we're at today. And I'd say where we're at today started in the early 2000s, and it's still going. So it's already out-sustained these other two pockets of this kind of back-to-the-land thinking movement, homesteading, what have you. And there's a lot of reasons for it that we'll get in today. But the other thing about them is the movements of those two periods were largely rural. There wasn't really a lot, other than some of the victory garden stuff, of people in what we think of suburbs today doing it. And to be fair, there weren't a lot of suburbs like we think of today. They were really a product of the 50s and 60s and 70s that we put in these more high-density suburbs, full service, all of that stuff. And here comes the plane again. Today we have homesteaders that are working land from 1/10 of an acre to 100 acres. That's directly off my list from 9 years ago, and I'd say that's still the case. There is a big movement, though, now for people to try to get what gets tossed around all the time is a little more land. And what people mean by that generally is a couple acres. And I think there's 2 or 3 things driving that. One, you get 2, 3, 5 acres. It changes the whole dynamic of what you can do with trees and livestock. And I think livestock drives it more than a desire to have a 1-acre cornfield or something like that. Our forefathers, our ancestors, when they got a hunk of land of that size or a little bit bigger, they would put in crops like corn or wheat or tobacco as money crops. Now, when you say money crops, you think, well, that means they were rolling in dough. No, they actually made very little in return for their effort, but it was something, and the land was there, and at least it produced some form of a cash crop. It's probably a better word than a money crop, that they would be able to get something for the product that they were producing. Today, I think that kind of thinking is pretty much dead. If somebody is growing wheat, they're really dedicated. They like wheat and they want it for themselves. I have met people that are growing some heirloom wheats and stuff that sell it to people, but honestly, when you ask them how much they sell, it's not a tremendous amount. I think mostly what people are looking for extra land for today is to be able to graze animals like sheep, or to have a dairy cow, or to pasture chickens or pork or something like that. And then you also have the movement toward, I just want a little bit more, have a little bit more ability to do some more homestead stuff. So those are people who are looking for the 1/2 acre to 1.5 acres. And an acre well done will wear your ass out. Don't ever think that it won't. But there's something else driving this as far as the little bit more land. People are just tired of being able to spit out their side window and hit their neighbor's house with their spit. I think people are tired of other people telling them how to live and what to do. And the reality is a massive amount of what goes on with code enforcement and things like that, and Department of Making Us Sad showing up and all, is not the little Poindexter that was picked on in school that now has an authority complex actually driving around and looking for somebody to use his authority on. There's some of that, but usually that accompanies being called out to a place, and while I'm here, I might as well drive around and see if I can write somebody up for another violation. It's a complaint-driven system. It is hugely a complaint-driven system. And And James says 1 acre is a big garden indeed. Dude, I'm not talking about a 1 acre garden. I'm talking about a 1 acre homestead. An acre homestead could have a 20th of an acre garden on it and feed a family, no problem. And all the other things you can do will wear you out if you really maximize it, is what I'm talking about. Anyway, yeah, people just have kind of switched on to this, that if my neighbors are just not right here, like on both sides of me, if they're over there and over there and over there and over there, then I get the biggest thing that people really are looking for today. And the biggest thing that people are, we talked about this yesterday, I've talked about it a lot lately, the most fundamental human right, the right to be left alone.